So the reason for our call today is to share some of what the Roosevelt Institute has been thinking about and working on with respect to where the macroeconomy is today, how we think about the challenges and dangers that could be that are confronting us in all kinds of ways with respect to the economy, but especially the danger or our concerns about allowing corporate power to continue to march on and or increase in a way that is extractive. That's especially obviously a concern at a time when so many small businesses and so many workers are living at so much peril. So we'll talk about that, and we will, because we're a policy institute, we'll have some policy recommendations as to what we think folks ought to do about that, what we collectively ought to do about that. And of course, we'll look forward to your questions. I think partly this addresses questions about the CARES Act and Rescue right now, but partly also this will be about what we ought to be doing much longer term. One of the things about Roosevelt is that we try to always bridge the near term, our very near term policy issues with a long term set of markers as to the economy and the politics we want to live in. So with that, I'm just going to introduce Julie and Bharat briefly, and then turn it over to Julie, who will be sharing a set of slides, and I think Bharat will too. So Julie Morgan is the VP of Research at Roosevelt. She runs our think tank. She's been with Roosevelt for 3 years. She first started at Roosevelt both as the executive director of the Great Democracy Initiative, which is a project of Roosevelt that focuses on policy, very specific policy details, or very specific policy that could become legislative. Julie's background, Julie had come from Senator Elizabeth Warren's office. She was at the Gates Foundation, then came to Roosevelt. She did take a brief hiatus over the last year to go work on the Warren campaign. And now she is back, and we are so grateful to have her running our think tank. Bharat Ramamurti, her friend and colleague, is also recently from the Warren campaign. He has joined us within the last month as our managing director of corporate power. And many of you also know that Bharat's expertise is in anti-monopoly, corporate, thinking about corporate governance, thinking about progressive taxation. So he has a wide range of interests and policy passions. Some of you also know that Bharat plays another role in our current politics. That is a very separate role from what he does at Roosevelt, but he, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but many of you know Bharat wears another hat in his private capacity working on congressional oversight. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Julie to kick us off.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here with you all this afternoon. I have to say that, sharing slides and operating a Zoom webinar is not my comfort zone. I'm much more used to being, as we all are, in a room with people. So I'm going to do my best here to make this work. And if it's not working, Felicia, could you be the person to shout it out that you're not seeing what I'm seeing, or something else? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen to get to my slides. Okay, that's already failing. It's already failing me. I checked this out earlier, and I can't. You know what? I'm just going to talk through the things that would have been in my slides.
Okay.
It really matters that much.
Great. And if you, okay, great.
Felicia, this was my bet that my Zoom.
I know. We had this whole conversation earlier. But I said, no, slides are going to work. You just have to fix that. Okay, go ahead and talk it through. It's fine.
I'm getting an error saying that my computer needs to restart. So I think we should.
No, I think you should just talk it through. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to start by reviewing some of the current economic trends that are facing our country and the underlying vulnerabilities in our economy. And then I'm going to move a little bit into how that has shaped Roosevelt's response. And then I'm going to turn it over to Bharat to do a deeper dive into the way we're thinking about the actual federal legislation that's passed recently, and particularly how we're thinking about approaching corporate power in these circumstances. So look, I mean, it's hard to review economic trends these days. You can hardly look at a newspaper without seeing what the current economic trends are. But obviously, our country is experiencing widespread layoffs and business closures that have far-reaching consequences for all of us. So unemployment claims have skyrocketed over the last few months. The latest unemployment numbers are absolutely breathtaking. The Congressional Budget Office is projecting a loss of nearly 27 million jobs in the second and third quarters of 2020. And we are likely to see that unemployment rate continue in the double digits throughout 2021. And, you know, as we all know, or at least we ought to know, these unemployment numbers are highly racialized. So Black and brown workers are particularly overrepresented in industries that are vulnerable to layoffs, like restaurants, retail, and personal care services. So as Roosevelt is thinking about the economic trends, we're trying to keep that layer of who is most affected by the economic trends in mind. And we're also keeping in mind that this displacement of workers, although in many ways is being seen as kind of at least by our government, as a momentary blip, we know that displacement will lengthen the time to economic recovery. And if history serves us, will actually result in lower wages for workers, even when they're reconnected with their employers. I think the other important economic trend to keep in mind here is that states are finding themselves under immense fiscal pressure right now. They're having to expand their public health services while also facing other fiscal pressures that result from the pandemic, including, you know, increased numbers of residents without health insurance, lower revenues, delayed tax filings, the need to move services online, including vast shifts in the way that they deliver public education right now. So we're already seeing states start to respond to that by either freezing or cutting their budgets, which is actually compounding the increase in unemployment, and we're likely to see more of that over time. So these economic trends, which are, again, it's a little bit, it feels a little bit silly to even cite the numbers from today, because every day they look a little bit worse than we thought they were. And I think it's fair to keep in mind that uncertainty is one of the trends that we're seeing and we'll expect to continue, that then compounds the actual variables here. But we can't address the current pandemic and rebuild economic strength without taking into account the underlying vulnerabilities in our economy before the virus hit. So I'm just going to go through a few of those underlying vulnerabilities. First of all, wealth inequality. The massive wealth and income inequality in the United States, which has grown significantly since the 1980s, has left a pretty significant population of the population living in precarity, and that precarity is only compounded by COVID-19. So we can cite the limited savings that people have, their increased levels of debt. All of these things are made significantly worse by both the health and the economic crises that we're experiencing. Another underlying vulnerability that sometimes gets left out of the conversation is the market-based nature of our healthcare systems. So the fate of our health has largely been ceded to markets in ways that were already hurting Americans far before this pandemic, but left us particularly vulnerable to an outbreak of these proportions. So from the gaps in our health insurance system to the power of pharmaceutical companies that prioritize profits over developing drugs and other treatments that are necessary to promote public health, our dependence on China for the production of key drug ingredients and protective equipment, to the consolidation in the hospital sector. So our health systems were unprepared to deal with a health crisis of this scale. Another underlying vulnerability here is the decline in bargaining power for American workers. This has left workers with lower earnings, less access to benefits like sick leave, and importantly, less ability to demand safe working conditions. Another important vulnerability to keep in mind here is the role that racism plays in our economy and our society overall. So the racism that's baked into the way that our systems, institutions, and markets work is setting the stage for the vastly unequal effects of both COVID itself and the economic crisis that it's created. And then finally, we want to keep in mind the larger financial risks here that were already at play before coronavirus entered our world. So the economic growth of our country has been experiencing prior to the pandemic masked underlying vulnerabilities in our economy. For example, before coronavirus hit the United States, experts were already warning of the dangers of mounting corporate debt. And it's important to remember, I think, that a lot of this debt was incurred in many cases to finance investor payouts rather than productive investments in our economy. So against this backdrop of economic trends that are facing us as a result of coronavirus, compounded by the underlying vulnerabilities of our system, Roosevelt started addressing the coronavirus economic crisis in, I think that Mike's paper in March was probably our first big foray into this space. Mike Consul put together a paper for us that laid out an initial blueprint of our response to the coronavirus economic crisis. That blueprint called for a couple of things. We called for cash payments to stabilize demand and relieve the immediate pressures on family budgets. We called for supports to workers, which of course included expanding UI, but also paid leave and other vital supports. We called for support to states and municipalities, backstops to prevent business collapses, and then also mechanisms to help businesses that businesses and industries that did collapse to rebuild while also maintaining accountability for those industries. And so through the first couple of phases of COVID response, and I'm going to let Bharat talk a little bit more about the specifics of the COVID response from the government. But through those first couple of phases, Congress actually addressed many of those prongs to some extent. And we saw that as, you know, a pretty good sign, right? But there are significant gaps that remain even in the pieces that we saw as positive steps, and then there are other pieces that really went unaddressed in the federal response. And so again, I'll let Bharat go into further detail on that, but that has kind of adjusted the way the Roosevelt Institute is looking at coronavirus response going forward. So we're really narrowing in on those areas where gaps remain. But more generally, I think it's important to say that, you know, we're approaching our coronavirus response work through the same lens that we've applied to our work more generally over the past several years, with a sharp focus on corporate power and public power. So we released our new Roles of the 21st Century report almost exactly a year ago. We released it last April. And obviously a lot has changed in the world since then, including the presidential primaries, but also the coronavirus pandemic. But I think we see that the core economic critique that we were making back then remains. So the dysfunction in our economy, which includes its ability to respond to large-scale health and economic crises, is driven by a concentration of power with the wealthiest and an erosion of government as a countervailing force. So given that, Roosevelt's response to the coronavirus economic crisis pushes forward on both the immediate relief that we see as necessary to stabilize the economy, but also the lasting structural changes necessary to build a more inclusive and resilient economy. And, you know, I think it's, in some ways, when we're putting out plans or proposals for coronavirus response, they're not always framed in that way, and the structural pieces don't always come to light. So I think it's really important to call that out. We're looking at not only how do we put in the infusions of cash that are really necessary through unemployment insurance, or as Bharat will discuss further, payroll stabilization, but also how do we use the levers of structural change to build the institutions and systems necessary to see change, like real structural change in our economy down the line. So I'm going to turn it over to Bharat to go into a deeper dive into how we're viewing the federal economic response. And in particular, he's going to touch on how we can curb corporate power while addressing this crisis. Bharat.
Thanks, Julie. All right, I'm going to give it a shot with this with these slides.
I think you can do it, Brett.
I'm sure yours will go better than mine.
We literally had this conversation. How is this possible? We had this conversation.
Show me once again.
Is it working?
You're always right, Julie. That's what that shows. Okay, Bharat.
Are people able to see these slides?
Yes, good.
Oh, amazing. Okay. All right. So, I have to use it over here. Okay, I'm learning. So, as Julie said, there's been a massive amount of congressional response to the COVID crisis over the last several weeks, and wanted to start by talking about what in those bills has worked fairly well. The good news, I guess. So the first is that there was a significant amount of spending to help hospitals and frontline healthcare workers. That was critically necessary. It's probably not enough, but it's at least provided a boost in the short term that was critically important. On the economic front, one of the most progressive and important things that honestly Congress has done in a very long time was a reformed approach to unemployment insurance. So in response to the fact that millions of people are going to be unemployed as a result of this crisis, Congress, first of all, increased the eligibility for who could get unemployment insurance to include, for example, what we would think of as gig workers. They reduced some of the barriers to claiming unemployment, like waiting periods. And then most critically, they took whatever your unemployment check would be based on your state's formula, and it depends state by state. And they added $600 per week to that amount across the board, which resulted in people fairly high up into the income spectrum being able to replace all of their lost wages through the unemployment insurance system. Now, what hasn't worked very well is that there's a massive backlog of claims for unemployment insurance, and a lot of people haven't gotten their checks yet. It's also only a 4-month program for the $600 bump. But in the short term, at least, it's a real help to a lot of folks, and a much more generous form of unemployment than we had up till this point. The third thing that we think works pretty well is money for the airline industry. So we'll talk a little bit later about how there's other giant buckets of money going to other industries. But the way that Congress treated the airlines was different. They, rather than just saying to companies, here is a lot of money and do with it what you will, what they did was say, here is money to the airline industry, but it is the amount of money you get is based on what your payroll was for your workers historically. And as a condition of taking this money, you must use the money to keep people on payroll. And if your payroll drops below 90% of what it was before, you lose the money, right? Or you have to start repaying it. It becomes a loan instead of a grant. And so what that has done is that it has helped keep 750,000 workers who, flight attendants and ground staff and so on, employed, and it will cover their payroll for the next 6 months or so. As we'll see later, that's a different approach than we've taken with other industries. Okay, what doesn't work? Number one is, as you might expect with economic activity shutting down, there's been a tremendous hit to state and local budgets, which rely on, for example, sales tax revenue. So far, the federal government has not provided a backstop to states in the sense of helping them fill the holes in their budgets because of this revenue loss. That is going to be a major issue in the next round of legislating around the coronavirus response in the next few weeks, with Democrats pushing for, I saw yesterday, as much as $1 trillion just to go to state and local governments, and Republicans saying that there should be no quote unquote bailout for state and local government. So the second is another big part of the response was a $500 billion fund that is administered jointly by the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, with the idea that the Federal Reserve would use that taxpayer money to backstop additional lending through the Federal Reserve to sort of medium-sized and big businesses. That money, which is in the form of loans, not in the form of grants, at the moment does not come with any conditions attached to it, which means that the Federal Reserve will be providing taxpayer-subsidized loans to large American companies, and essentially relying on those companies to do with that money what they will. So there's no requirement that they keep workers on payroll. There's no limitation that they avoid stock buybacks or dividends while they're repaying the loan. And there's no limitations on executive compensation during the time which they're getting this loan. So, in our view, that is a flawed approach that is effectively, based on what we know about how big corporations have acted over the last decade or so, a pot of money that is going to help support executives and shareholders rather than workers at those companies. The third thing is just oversight. So obviously, if you are pumping trillions of dollars out the door, as Congress has been doing over the last few weeks, and doing it through programs that do not have the benefit of months and months of the normal legislative process with hearings and markups and floor debate and so on, there's going to be serious problems in how those programs are put together and administered, which means that you need robust oversight. Congress created 3 different oversight bodies in the CARES Act, which was the major legislation that they've passed so far. One of them is a new special inspector general to oversee a bunch of the spending. Obviously, the president gets to nominate that person, and he nominated a White House lawyer to do that job. So, there's concerns in Congress that that person is not going to be providing robust oversight. There's also a panel of existing inspectors general that is supposed to be working together to oversee how these programs are operating. The person who was supposed to lead that panel was the inspector general, I believe, of the Defense Department. Donald Trump promptly fired him when he was put up for that job. And so it shows that the president is able to influence both of these oversight bodies that Congress created. The third body is the one that I'm on, that Felicia mentioned, the Congressional Oversight Commission. All of the members of that commission are selected by members of Congress. The issue at the moment is that we don't have a chair of the commission yet, which means that we're somewhat limited in what we can be doing so far. And then the fourth issue is the one that I think has probably gotten the most attention so far, which is problems with the Paycheck Protection Program, which was the congressional response to small businesses that are facing steep revenue losses as a result of coronavirus. And so just to go into more depth on that, the way the program operates is that you're supposed to, that banks are supposed to provide loans to small businesses based in part on what their payroll costs were historically. And then they are sort of low interest loans. But if the small business uses the money to maintain at least 75% of its payroll going forward, it converts into a grant. So they don't have any repayment obligation. And so the idea behind the program was essentially let's create an incentive for small businesses to keep people employed during the crisis. There's been a lot of problems with how the program is operated. The first one is that it operates through banks, right? So the banks have to provide this loan to businesses. The Small Business Administration then basically guarantees to the bank that if the person does not repay the loan, the Small Business Administration will pick up the costs for them. So it's risk-free for the bank, but we're relying on banks to do the process of physically transmitting the money to these companies. And so what happens is that, number one, banks privilege the folks who have pre-existing relationships with them, right? If you already have a small business account with a bank, it's easier for that bank to provide the loan for you. And they have their own incentives, financial incentives to sort of keep existing customers happy. And so what that has done is that it has made it harder for really, really small businesses that may not already have good existing banking relationships to get access to the money. The second design flaw was that Congress gave banks bigger fees for processing bigger loans through this program, which has had an obvious impact, which is that banks are seeking out opportunities to do bigger loans, or at least starting with those first, because that means more money for them. That means, again, companies that have pre-existing relationships that are bigger and more established are getting these loans first. Exacerbating these issues is that rather than Congress saying, here's the universe of companies that are eligible for this money, here are the limitations on the amount of money that they can get, but any company that meets these criteria, we'll provide as much funding as it takes to make sure that every company that meets these criteria gets the loan. Instead, they've been funding this with a cap. So at first they said $350 billion. They added more money recently to it. But the problem is that when there's limited funding, there's a mad scramble, obviously, from companies to access this money. And the banks are going to sort of triage all of the interest coming in based, again, on who's got a pre-existing relationship with us, how can we generate the most amount of fees. And so the uncapped, the sort of cap on funding has worsened some of the other design flaws in the program. All of this has resulted in small business owners of color getting hit particularly hard, both because they tend to operate smaller businesses, and secondly, because they tend to have less well-established connections with the banking industry. One analysis has found that 90% of businesses owned by people of color have been or will likely be shut out of this program. And so that's, you're going to see a massive, unfortunately, you're setting up for a massive, wealth loss from those communities. The other thing, obviously, this is the corporate power. I run the corporate power project, and so I want to focus on how this all deals with what the impact is on corporate power. And I think it's important to step back and think about the combined effect of all of these trends. So, at a very high level, what we have, as we just talked about, is a sort of poorly designed and run program to help small businesses that may result in literally hundreds of thousands of small businesses across the country closing up shop. You combine that with this Fed and Treasury program, which provides extraordinarily generous and immediate and easy to administer support to big businesses, right? So, a year from now, 2 years from now, you could have a situation where the big established businesses have only grown bigger and stronger. And there's all of this sort of market share and opportunity for them to scoop up because a lot of the small businesses have shuttered. And so the concern is that that is going to result in even more concentration across several industries. The other issue is that we're currently already at about 20% unemployment. It could end up being even higher by the time we get through the worst of this. I think a lot of folks are operating under this assumption that we quote unquote we switch the economy back on, and all these people who lost jobs, they'll just go back to their old jobs at the same pay at the same companies. It's not necessarily going to be that way, right? And we're running an experiment that we've never really run before, in the sense that we don't know what it looks like to transition back from 20% unemployment in these kinds of conditions. It's quite possible that businesses use the fact that they've already laid off a lot of workers to, for example, shift those jobs overseas where the jobs could be cheaper. You could have businesses using the fact that there's a massive amount of workers looking for work as an opportunity to try and cut wages further or offer fewer benefits, right? And all of this will further dilute worker power. The third dynamic is that if we continue to have such inadequate funding for state and local governments, a lot of the services that they provide, there's going to be opportunities for companies to step in and provide those instead, right? There's going to be calls for privatizing a lot of the things that state and local governments do because there's going to be such a budget crunch. And again, that represents a transfer of power away from the public sector to the private sector. And it's always important as well to keep an eye on the fact that as their economic power grows, the political power of big businesses grows as well. And I think you're already starting to see that, where a lot of this, the push to quote unquote reopen the economy and get people back to work, a lot of that is coming from big business interests. And it's because they want labor to get back into the office or back into the factory or whatever it is, so that they can start generating profits again, even if that means putting people at risk. And you pair that with the fact that the number one priority of the business community, which is now apparently Mitch McConnell's number one priority, is in the next round of legislation to create sort of blanket immunity for companies from negligence claims if employees get sick. And so you can see how those two things work together, right? Big business says, let's get everybody back to work, but also let's make sure that nobody can sue us if we don't provide them with the adequate protective equipment or provide other, adhere to other public health and safety measures. Those kinds of trends are only going to get worse as the political and economic power of big businesses grows. All right, so what do we do about it? I think the first thing is to think about how to build on the Paycheck Protection Program so that it operates more like a paycheck guarantee. And so those are proposals that Senator Sanders has introduced in the Senate, that Congresswoman Jayapal has introduced in the House, and that other countries like Denmark have adopted, which is essentially, we have this problem right now where businesses aren't making money. The solution is for the government to step in and basically assume the payroll obligations of these businesses in the short term. And it's worked remarkably well. In Denmark, again, while the US has an unemployment rate of 20%, in Denmark, the unemployment rate has gone from 4% to 4.6% during this crisis. So, how do we expand on the PPP so it operates more like that? Number one, you make sure that the eligibility doesn't cut off at small businesses only, right? Medium-sized and big businesses employ workers too, and we want to make sure that those workers are taken care of. You would need to, as I said before, change it from a set amount of funding to essentially an uncapped amount of funding, so that there's no sort of fighting for resources, and so that everybody gets the money that they need. I think that there's a way of circumventing the banks and avoiding some of the problems that causes by working directly with private payroll processing companies. So a company like ADP, for example, hundreds of thousands of businesses use ADP to administer their payroll. And as a result, ADP has access to the bank accounts of the small businesses and has access to the bank accounts of the employees of that small business. There seem to be opportunities to essentially use their existing data and payment systems to make sure that the money gets to the people who need it more quickly. And I think that if no matter what you do, you're going to need to reform the program so that there's money for truly small businesses, right? There's a lot of businesses who don't use a payroll processor. They still do everything by hand or by book. They don't have a banking relationship because they're funded by family money or friends. They are harder to reach, and as a result, we need to make sure that there's money set aside specifically for them, and that we design the program so that we are making sure that they get money too. The second big change is if we're going to be pumping loans into the system for big businesses, that money should come with real strings attached, so that the companies use the money not just to finance more stock buybacks and dividends or mergers and acquisitions and executive compensation, but actually retaining workers and, importantly, rehiring workers that they may have already let go. We have leverage essentially over these companies because they all need financing in the short term. We should use that leverage to push them to do things that are good for their workers. And I think that would have a massive impact. The third is pretty straightforward, helping state and local governments. As I said, there's going to be, I think, a big legislative fight about that over the next few weeks, about how much money and how the money is apportioned between different state and local governments. A fourth thing is, again, to try and anticipate some problems that might arise if these trends hold. So, for example, the private equity industry stands to do very well after this, because again, you're going to have a lot of businesses that were pretty promising businesses that were totally derailed by the coronavirus, and it's an opportunity for this industry to buy those companies at a very cheap price, and then do what private equity often does, which is sort of strip the value out of those companies and provide great returns for private equity managers, but not produce a healthy business. I think reforming private equity, therefore, so that its incentives are more aligned with the business itself doing well, is important. I think that it's also important to put a limit on what kinds of mergers can happen in industries right now. Like I said, a lot of the trends that we're seeing are going to further increase concentration in these industries. I think an easy way to say, to stop that, or at least limit it, is to say, we are going to put a moratorium on mergers at the moment, or at least a presumption that a merger should not go forward unless you meet certain strict conditions. And part of that as well is breaking up existing monopolies that exist in tech and elsewhere. And then finally, there's a suite of policies that Roosevelt has been focused on about promoting worker power, right? Having workers represented on corporate boards as a way to influence corporate decision making. Changes to corporate charters as a way of pushing them away from this idea that they only exist to maximize the amount of money that they send to shareholders each quarter. There's some very basic changes you can make to executive compensation so that the interests of executives are aligned with the long-term success of the corporation, rather than bumping up the share price by a couple of dollars over the next few weeks. And then finally, this is a good opportunity to establish sectoral bargaining, which is the idea that obviously right now you have what we would think of as firm level bargaining, right? So the workers at General Motors form a union and they negotiate with the management of General Motors. In other countries, you have sectoral bargaining, which is the idea that fast food workers, whether you work at McDonald's or Taco Bell or Wendy's, join together to negotiate with the fast food industry and collectively set wages and benefits for workers in that industry. And what you find is that that working together like that produces better outcomes for workers. And it interestingly, a lot of the firm level opposition to unionization is the idea that we're going to be worse off than our competitor if our employees form a union and have more power to negotiate better wages than the firm down the block that's our competitor. By putting everyone together in the same boat, you might actually reduce some of the management side resistance to unionization and so on. Anyway, that's our list, and that's the end of the slides. And I think we're opening it up to questions.
We are. I've got two questions. The first is from Jean Ross, and the second is from Keisha Gaskins-Nathan. So, Jean, you want to go ahead and ask your question? Make sure to unmute yourself. Hi, Jean.
Hopefully I'll mute. Thank you. This is super, super interesting, and appreciate the agenda of changes to the PPP program. Given sort of the speed at which all of this is happening and the amount of money that's already gone out the door, what's the advocacy strategy for reform? And is there any way to sort of go back and recapture or retroactively impose some of the recommendations that you're proposing? And thanks, really, really interesting conversation.
Felicia, you could probably take my question at the same time. I think it's of the same flavor.
Great. Keisha, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and ask. And then I'm going to turn it to Bharat to answer, and then maybe Julie to also add her answer. But yeah, Keisha.
I put it in the chat window, but basically noting that the private equity firms already got a huge, big tax break gift in the second care bill in the terms of deductibility and interest on debt. And it seems unlikely that we'll get reform for private equity out of the same session that already handed them this big Christmas gift in spring. So kind of like, of all these proposals, what should be looking at as the most likely? Are those the same as the ones that are most needed? So I think it's kind of, like I said, it's very similar to what Jean asked.
Sure. So I think that the upside of Congress moving quickly is that there's also opportunities for reform relatively quickly. There's going to be a new package coming out in a few weeks, likely. It appears that the House, led by Democrats, is going to be taking the lead on putting that together. And so I think there's an opportunity as part of that package to push for some of these reforms. Now, obviously, the Republicans control the Senate and they control the White House, so there's going to be disagreement on aspects of it. But in the short term, I think that there's a lot of appetite for changes to the PPP, and I think the things that are on our list are likely to be in the mix in some way as part of that next package of reforms. The changes to the way that the money goes to big businesses, that doesn't require an act of Congress. The Fed and the Treasury are designing these programs, and they can snap their fingers and change and add conditions to the money that's going out the door. Just yesterday, they announced a series of changes to one of the existing lending facilities that were rather significant, without any additional action from Congress. So that's a matter of pushing for reform at the Fed and the Treasury rather than trying to get a new bill through Congress. Similarly, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the adequate amount of funding for state and local governments in the new bill. On private equity, I agree that it's unlikely that in the next few months before the election, there's going to be significant reform. I think that depending on the outcome of the election, there could be appetite for reform of the industry in 2021. I'm a little biased because I worked on this proposal, but Senator Warren has put out a proposal on reforming private equity that actually has pretty broad support in the Democratic caucus in the Senate. That does what I described, which is align the incentives of private equity managers with the interests of the companies that they are purchasing, which I think is a very good starting point for that kind of reform. And the upside of that is that a decent amount of the things in that bill could actually be accomplished administratively. So it would not require an act of Congress. It would just require the right people in place at running the IRS and the Treasury Department and the SEC.
Julie, I want to make sure you get a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, sure. I was just kind of scribbling down some notes as Bharat was talking about the ways that we're thinking about this overall. And I think about the things that we want in a couple of different buckets, right? That we kind of have like big asks that only progressives want. We have big asks that are largely aligned with political pressure, where there's political pressure on Republicans and on Democrats. And I think about things like, backstopping states or changes to PPP as being in that bucket, where perhaps the changes that they want are not exactly what we want, but there's movement towards it. Small asks and then executive action. And I think our strategy on all of those is a little bit different. So on the big asks where we're the only ones, not Roosevelt, but progressives more broadly are the only ones who want it. I think our best strategy is to start to work to coalesce groups around a particular change, and then to kind of marshal the data and research that we have. I think data and research, sometimes it's very wonky and stays in its own little box. I think right now there's an opportunity to use that because the trends are so stark. We can tell a story about what's happening in the economy. When you have 20% unemployment, we really are in a place where there's opportunity for ground shifting depending on the story that we tell with those numbers. For the big asks where there's some political pressure, it's a little bit more of an inside game, I think, to try to make sure that the changes and tweaks that we want to shape things like paycheck stabilization or state and local backstopping happen. And then I just want to highlight the small asks because I think it's an important piece that we've been focused on at Roosevelt. There are certain things, the one that comes to mind is Fed accounts. We have certain changes that we're focused on that we view as structural changes, right? They really would change the way the economy works and for whom it works, but they're relatively small. They're either no cost or low cost, and they're not particularly politically controversial. And so Fed accounts is basically the idea that individuals would be able to get bank accounts through the Federal Reserve in the same way that banks do. That's something that would increase the effectiveness of some of the relief that the government is trying to get out right now, but it also would have downstream effects both for individuals and for businesses. So those are things that we can push more directly than we might be able to on these big pieces. And then, as Bharat mentioned, I think executive action has to be a focus here, where we are headed into an election. We may see a change in administration, and we may have a bigger opportunity down the line to actually make some of these changes without Congress.
Great, thanks. I've got two more questions from Naomi and Robin. We might have time for one more question after that, but I'm actually going to have Naomi, why don't you go ahead and ask your question, and then Robin, why don't you go ahead and ask yours, and then we'll see how much time we have left.
Sure. Okay, so I think I heard the stat that like 90% of Black-owned businesses would not end up being eligible for the small business protection programs. And that could likely lead to a huge drain of wealth, Black wealth, which is kind of has a parallel with the 2008 financial crisis. And, you know, the trends in home ownership, how like a lot of like ground of like home ownership kind of devolved after that crisis. So I'm wondering, like, what is the shape of the program that would be necessary? Like, what would it look like to have a program that would stabilize and maintain, or even like help support and grow Black commerce? And like, what do you think is going to happen to Black commerce in the next, few years?
Yeah.
So actually, yeah, like, go ahead. Why don't you go take these questions quickly, and then we'll go to Robin's question, and then I see a question from Kong.
Yeah, I mean,
and then we'll close out.
I'm deeply concerned about that. I agree that the parallel to the 08 crisis and the drain in Black wealth that we saw as foreclosures hit that community. I'm really worried about that. I think Congress took a decent step towards fixing it in the most recent bill that they passed, because they set aside money in the PPP for community development financial institutions, which are sort of nonprofit lenders that have better ties into the Black community. They set aside money for that specifically for small businesses, so businesses with revenue under a certain amount of money. That should be helpful. I think that you kind of need an all of the above approach here, because and part of it may also be moving away from a PPP type approach to a paycheck protection approach as a way of ensuring that businesses are getting money out of this program. But I think that we should be doing all that we can to avoid what happened to Black home ownership happening to Black business ownership as a result of this crisis. And I don't think that Congress has done enough so far.
Great. Robin, do you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then Kong?
Sure. I was just wondering what the possibilities are for using sort of some of the relief money, either through the Fed municipal liquidity facility, or what Congress may do in terms of block grants or other assistance to the state and municipal governments as a way of pushing back against some of this, thinking about state and city responses to sort of preempt private equity, for example.
Yeah, Julie or Bharat, do you want to take this Fed question?
Bharat.
Bharat, go ahead.
Sure. So, First, the Fed has already decided to expand. After they put out an initial version of what the municipal lending facility would look like, it became clear that they had set the eligibility criteria too high. And so it excluded any state, any county with fewer than 2 million people and any city with fewer than 1 million people, which had the effect of excluding the 35 cities in America with the highest proportion of Black residents, including Detroit and Atlanta and Baltimore. There was a lot of public outcry about that. They changed that. And so now a lot of those cities are eligible now. It's obviously the case that a loan from the Fed is not as good as just money from the federal government. And so it's a very good question. It's actually one that I think we're going to try and look into specifically, is how should state and local governments think about responding to this crisis, and what are the progressive options, including options for raising revenue in the short term in a progressive way, rather than responding by cutting teacher pay or firing police officers or firefighters or shutting down parks. But it's an important question.
Yeah, let me just add, I see some Seattle people on the phone or on the Zoom, and I've gotten this question from Washington State residents in particular, but there is a real interest in trying to figure out what wealth taxation looks like at the state level specifically. Bharat's nodding. And that is something that I think could be very important, because even if we see the kind of money that progressives are asking for in CARES 2, which is at least $500 billion for states and municipalities, it probably won't be enough given both the revenue shortfall and the increase in healthcare costs, for example, at the state level. So I think state revenue raising is going to have to be on the table, at least as a potential solution. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Kong, you raised your hand.
Hi, thanks. This has been super interesting. Thank you. So my question is less about policy and more about public support. I'm curious about your thoughts on sort of building the public will to support any of these policy proposals, especially in light of, I think, some there's sort of two minds out there. There's one like it's been unfair and we should change it so that it's more fair, and one that's like, wow, there's more money and yet I don't get it and government still just doesn't work. And it's stacked against me or us.
Yeah, we just did some polling on this, which I'm happy to recount, but it's a very thorny political question. Julie, I don't know if you wanted to address any of the public will questions. I can also say a little bit about where I think the polling is.
Do you want to talk about the polling first? I feel like it's a good backdrop for.
Yes. So with the giant blinking caveat that polling does not necessarily equal what actually happens, and or what actually happens at the voting booth or what actually happens in politics. What is striking about where public sentiment is right now is just how strongly progressive policies are popular. So you see across any of the things that Bharat said that progressives are asking for, an improved PPP, extended unemployment insurance, money for states and localities, you see something between 75 and 85% of all Americans saying that they think these are effective things and they want them and they want more of them. You see slightly more higher numbers for Democrats than for Republicans, but overall, this is, in a country that's extremely divided, this is a very, very, very big set of numbers. This is polling that we just did with our friends and colleagues at the Groundwork Collaborative. So that's one important thing. The second important thing is that when you ask people, do you believe that the federal government right now should only handle the problems in front of us, or should the federal government also seek to redress longstanding economic inequities that are structural? The public 60-40 says longstanding problems are what got us here, and longstanding problems are what have to be solved. So I think the problem is not public will. I think the problem is the convoluted process by which public will actually gets translated into executive or even executive action. Legislative or even executive action. But Julie, you may have a few other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the polling on a lot of progressive priorities has been pretty strong, but I think in particular, the you know, this question of distrust of government is real, right? That we see that across the board. I think it's part of the reason why we see stronger support for things that sort of fall into the corporate power and regulatory bucket, where even people who have strong distrust in government's ability to provide services to them would like to see the government take some action to hold corporations and others more accountable and to cut down on government corruption. So I think we should really leverage the places where there's the most bipartisan support there, and a lot of those fall into the corporate power bucket. I think the other thing that comes to mind on this question is that, you know, there's some good research that shows that people's their thoughts on trust in government are shaped by their interactions with government. And we're right now increasing ineffective interactions with government and decreasing the effective ones. So things like interactions with the post office tend to raise people's level of trust in government because it works in a fairly routine way, and we're eliminating that. And then we're increasing their frustrations with interactions with things like the an overloaded unemployment system, and for business owners, a paycheck guarantee program that doesn't work. And so I think progressives, at the same time that we are trying to help people get access to those things, we can't let go of the narrative of building good public programs so that people have positive interactions, and holding accountable these programs that are actually by design decreasing people's trust in government.
Great. You know, I want to be mindful of people's time. It is 1 minute before 1 on the East Coast. So I'm going to go ahead and just thank everybody for coming. It's been a great conversation. Thanks to Julie and Bharat. We have a terrific team here at Roosevelt, and we're so glad that you all are helping to anchor it. We will definitely send out, sorry, that's my dog. We will send out the slides. We will send out that polling. And I know some other people have sent me individual questions in the chat, which we didn't get to, but we are happy to try to answer them on a one-on-one basis if you get them to us. We just thank you very much for your support. Keep fighting the good fight. We'll be there with you. Thank you.